3rd of February 1945, 9:17 hours, over the Tempelhof marshalling yards. The glass in the B-17G's nose is cold against Lieutenant Eddie Novak's cheek as the Norden sight steadies, the crosshairs creeping along a lattice of rails. Oxygen tastes metallic. Someone on interphone coughs and clicks to hot. Below, Berlin lies in a grey winter hush, the kind that swallows sound until flak writes it back into the air. The formation is a city in motion. Boxes stacked from 20 to 27,000 feet, staggered for interval. The pilot holds station on the lead ship's wingtip. The toglier hums through his checks. Eddie would have counted the load. 5,000 to 8,000 pounds of general-purpose bombs, like a rosary, fuses, intervals, drift angle. They were one of roughly 1,003 fortresses dispatched. 937 would drop on Berlin. 23 would not return. On the ground, in a station office already brown with smoke, Frau Martha Köhler flips a ledger she no longer trusts. Her pencil hesitates over columns labelled wagons, coal, wounded. The Tempelhof yards regulate a city's breath. Today it stutters. The first barrage walks up from the suburbs, black puffs stepping a disciplined ladder toward the stream, and the B-17 shivers with near-miss shockwaves. The bombardier keeps the rectangle in the glass, nudging corrections as if adjusting a microscope. Far out to the flanks, P-51s slant into the sun, smugglers of confidence. Eddie can't see them, not really, but he believes in them the way men believe in bridges. Their fuel rides in long drop tanks, their orders lately, are different. Hunt, not just babysit. That change will matter more than any single stick of bombs. Steady, steady. The pilot's voice is thin with altitude. The yards appear as a circuit board, bright threads and switch boxes. Eddie arms, breathes and squeezes the release. The fortress rises as weight leaves. Below, rails buckle, couplings snap, boxcars fling themselves sideways in dirt and steam. In the tower west of the zoo, Unteroffizier Karl Ritter feels the 12.8-centimetre twins recoil, hears brass ring on steel decking, tastes cordite and concrete dust. Eddie keeps his eye in the glass for the long 3 seconds, counting as practice demands. When he finally looks up, the sky is polka-dotted with flak, and the stream goes on to the horizon. Too many ships to number, too many contrails to thread. He does not yet know that this day will be remembered less for where bombs fell than for the shattering fact that 1,000 heavy bombers came in daylight and stayed. He toggles the safety back on and hears the pilot. Let's go find the sun. Somewhere ahead, the hunters are already ranging. The next lesson of the war is waiting in the escort's new orders, written not in poetry but in policy, and it will change the very weather of the sky. At briefing, they chalked it as if it were an afterthought. The first duty of 8th Fighter Command was to destroy German fighters, not cling to the bomber stream, not orbit like shepherd dogs, destroy. Lieutenant Sam Tex Delaney rolled the word on his tongue while a crew chief cinched his Mae West and tapped the panel where the drop tanks were plumbed. With tanks aboard, a P-51D could lope deep into the Reich and still climb to high cover, fast enough to choose the fight and decisive enough to end it. It would have felt like sacrilege a year earlier. But the arithmetic of daylight war had shifted. The Mustang's Packard-built Merlin sang clean at altitude. At roughly 440 miles an hour, it could range ahead, bounce, and then reappear where the enemy least wished it. Delaney's squadron leader walked them through fuel ladders and time-over-target windows, a choreography that kept sweeps braided with the bomber stream without chaining them to it. Free hunters. The phrase tasted like sun after months of cloud and caution. They crossed the coast in a loose weave, guns charged, eyes hunting a glint at 10 o'clock high. Contact came first as a sliver against the contrails, a swarm of BF-10-9s climbing too late. Tex checked his mirror, rolled inverted, and dropped in with a short burst that turned a canopy to diamonds. He did not watch the parachute. he was already searching for the next mistake. Far below and far behind, fortresses droned east, secure not because he circled them, but because he had made the air ahead inhospitable. On egress they found a field camouflaged with larch boughs, the runway scarred but serviceable. This was where the new order bit deepest. Strafing would once have been an afterthought. Now it was doctrine. The Mustangs came in line abreast, 50 caliber streams walking across dispersal. Fuel trucks bloomed. A parked twin-engine night fighter jerked, settled and smoked. As they climbed away, Tex felt that complicated mixture the war had taught him, satisfaction braided to unease. Somewhere a German crew chief would have been brave enough to run toward that fire with a hand extinguisher and a wrench. Back over the North Sea, contrails feathered into cirrus and radios returned to small talk. On the interphone of Eddie Novak's fortress, the pilot called a heading for home. Over Berlin, flak still wrote its angry calligraphy, but the sky just beyond the city felt newly thinned of predators. The memo on a chalkboard, plain words in a dusty room, had shifted the weight of the day. The safest place for a bomber, Tex thought as the channel flashed silver ahead, was a sky where the enemy simply could not get airborne in time. The elevator doors on the zoo tower opened to a cathedral, concrete ribs, steel girders, cables humming like organ strings. Unteroffizier Karl Ritter checked the elevation wheel with a glove, then laid his hand on the breech of the twin 12.8-centimetre guns, as if on a living thing. The Berlin sky was low, and the light the colour of ash. A runner passed the latest barrage data from the predictor. Altitude 27,000, drift east, fuse 62. A minute later the tower swallowed the first impacts. Shards rang in the stairwells. Flak work was choreography and faith. The loader's boots skidded on brass. The trainer called bearings. The layer sang out elevation. The fire control officer, jaw clenched, authorized a timed curtain that would, in theory, force the American boxes to turn or die in it. Karl knew the theory and the limits. A fortress could take punishment and keep formation, and the stream today looked endless. He had seen the morning photograph on a staff table, assembly areas over England feathered white with contrails that braided into highways toward the east. Berlin had three giants, Zoo, Humboldthain, Friedrichshain, each a fortress within a city, each a concrete sermon in the gospel of flak. Here the 12.8 seconds spoke, and below them rings of 20 and 37mm guns stitched the lower air. Fuel was rationed. Replacement barrels came late. The telephone grid crackled. Even shells smelled thin. He remembered a rumour from a signals corporal, a figure nobody believed the first time. The Americans had produced something like 96,000 military aircraft in 1944 alone. Karl had no way to check it, but the number haunted him as surely as the contrails. If it were even half true, it meant that a single year of one enemy's factories outweighed all the bravery and skill inside this tower. It would have sounded impossible to any soldier raised on the primacy of will. A fresh ripple of bursts stitched toward the lead box, black flowers widening as their timed fuses expired. A fortress staggered, dropped a wing, then clawed back into its slot, a sight that was both infuriating and admirable. Karl adjusted elevation a fraction. The floor shuddered, the tower breathed cordite and hot oil, the phone barked for more. He worked the wheel and thought of his wife's last letter, ration cards folded inside, written in a careful hand that did not mention fear. Outside, rails screamed, trains stalled, and a clerk somewhere crossed out another promise. Inside, the guns kept their rhythm. Load, lock, fire, extract. Karl did not hate the men inside those aircraft. He hated the math that stretched from an Ohio foundry to this concrete room like a steel wire. When the order came to cease fire for a moment, smoke and ranging, he lifted his head and listened to the sky and heard only more engines coming. The morning after the raid, the smoke hung low and mean. Frau Martha Köhler unlocked her office at the Tempelhof Yards and found grit on the desk like ground glass. The window had held. The timetable had not. She sharpened a pencil and drew a ruler across the page, making columns that comforted her. Train number, destination, wagons, priority. Then she began writing a word that would fill the day: cancelled. What the bombers had done was not dramatic in the way posters prefer. It was surgical damage multiplied by scale. Craters chewed switchyards into puzzles whose pieces no longer fit. Rails had heaved like thawed snakes. The signal box down the line had lost both power and nerve. Every jammed switch became an hour. Every hour a trainload of something needed at a front that did not care for excuses. A marshalling yard is a factory for movement. The Americans had taken a wrench to its heart. Across the channel, in a low hut that smelled of coffee and damp wool, Lieutenant Eddie Novak watched strike photos tacked to a wall under thumbtacks. The prints looked almost abstract, the neat rows of coal hoppers now tilted, the spiderweb of tracks clipped and blackened. He stood in a line of men who held paper cups and tried to stand in a way that did not betray whose bunk would be empty tonight. 23 fortresses had not come home. The number was read flatly, as if tone could blunt it. Debriefing would have covered the craft before the cause. Turbulence on the bomb run, airspeed drift, flak bursts that bracketed like metronomes. Then the larger frame came into focus. Rail nodes were the lungs of a capital. Tempelhof was one of the largest. A single day's interruption would ripple outward through tonight's orders and tomorrow's movements. Eddie learned to hear the click in the intelligence officer's voice when operational effects aligned. Photographs, reports from resistance rails, the voice traffic from disrupted stations. Marta kept at her columns. She would have normally expected hundreds of wagons to pass under her pen by noon. Instead, she made notes about detours that existed only on maps. A faint warmth came through the wall from a stove in a room she could not reach because the hall was blocked by a collapsed filing cabinet. She used a ration coupon to buy tea from a woman who had boiled it twice already. When the phone rang, it was a station master asking for miracles she no longer had to give. By evening, the smoke thinned, but the ledger did not. On the airfield at Eddie's base, ground crews walked the torn skins of the fortresses with flashlights, chalking circles around holes and writing estimates on aluminum in grease pencil. One city counted absences, the other counted repairs. Somewhere between the two, the war turned another invisible gear, and the teeth meshed. The jets were not rumours anymore. Feldwebel Walter Kruger stood on the tarmac at Brandenburg-Brist with a helmet under his arm and the Me-262's turbines coughing into a sustained metallic whine. The air smelled of kerosene and thawing mud. Crews waved him forward with paddles. He lined up on a runway patched by night labour and pointed the nose toward a hole in the cloud. When the brakes released, the push was a hand between his shoulders. The Me-262A-1 was a revelation and a compromise. It could make 540 miles an hour in level flight, and its 4 Mk-108 30mm cannon could rip a bomber from nose to tail in 2 seconds. With R-4M rockets hung under the wings, 24 in neat, wicked clusters, it could turn a formation into geometry problems the Americans could not solve with turret arcs alone. But it was also a creature of fuel trucks and straight concrete, needy and impatient. Takeoff and landing were where piston-engined escorts waited with malice and range. Today the controller's voice came clipped and urgent. Intercept east of Berlin, Angels 26, American heavy stream. Walter climbed through ragged cloud and broke into a sudden panorama of aluminum and contrails. The speed difference felt indecent. He rolled to a rear quarter, sighted a high left box, and thumbed a short burst. A B-17's starboard wing quivered and spalled. He did not linger. The closure rate punished hesitation. Another pass, another strike, then a ripple of rockets that lashed a gap between aircraft and bloomed dark holes among contrails that twisted like torn silk. On the American side, Lieutenant Sam Tex Delaney caught just flashes. streaks that were there and then not there. He could not outrun a jet, but he could hunt it where it was mortal, the traffic pattern. He called his flight down the glide path toward a nearby field and found a 262 on final, gear down, a bird with its breast unarmoured. The Mustangs bit. On the way out, they stitched fuel drums for good measure. Doctrine again, deny the enemy not only the fight, but the chance to arrange one. Walter landed hard, braking with a prayer, and taxied past men with extinguishers who looked both brave and tired. He had, he believed, knocked down 2. He also knew that somewhere, even now, the bomber stream was turning toward a target and would, despite his best, deliver. He thought of the boys on the dispersal, sleeves rolled, working with the kind of competence that makes defeat a slow humiliation. Jets had given him back a sense of agency. Arithmetic would take it away again. He taxied past a line of empty frames that would never fly again. 18 March 1945 began with chalk and weather. The board in group ops became an avalanche, assembly points, altitudes, times, arrows that seemed to require a second wall. Then the number took shape, not as rumour, but as roster. More than 1,000 heavy bombers and hundreds of fighters rising from England in bands that would, soon enough, braid into a single intent. Eddie Novak fastened his oxygen hose and thought of the way maps never show the depth of a sky. They formed over the coast like continents unmoored. Lead navigators ticked boxes, radios filled with call signs. Far ahead, the escorts fanned out. Doctrine made muscle memory now. Hunt first. The target set was Berlin again, rail stations, tank works, the nerves and sinews of a city short of breath. Eddie's pilot tapped the drift gauge with one gloved knuckle, a habit like knocking on wood. The flak over the city was a black weather that moved of its own accord. Concentric belts tried to put a lid on the sky. The flak towers threw their 12.8-centimetre punches. Somewhere below, Marta would have flinched at the ripples of concussion and added one more cancelled line to her ledger. Somewhere above, Me-262S slashed and vanished, their speed a kind of insult, their passes leaving ragged holes in a formation that closed again, as if on instinct. The bombs went from potential to memory in one long, disciplined cascade. Numbers do not care whether men are ready for them. 1,329 heavy bombers and 733 fighters set out. 1,221 of the bombers struck Berlin. More than 3,000 tons fell. 24 bombers and 6 fighters were lost. 714 bombers came home holed and still airworthy. The impossible statistic was not merely size, but resilience, an industrial promise kept in aluminum and rivets. Eddie counted the seconds after release, held the nose straight and felt the ship rise as weight left. Through the side window, he caught a shape out of place. A fortress with a wingtip chewed ragged, hanging on the formation like a man on a moving train. They would have made room for it, as crews did. A quiet shifting of geometry that said, we all get home or none do. The interphone carried the kind of humour that lives next to fear. A joke about English tea that made no sense and therefore worked. On the way out, Tex's flight curved wide to sweep a recovery field, catching a jet with its wheels still cycling. On the other side of the city, Carl's tower crew stood in smoke and counted fuses left. The raid had been the largest, and the word felt less like a boast than a diagnosis. When Eddie climbed down the ladder hours later and his boots hit concrete, he looked back along a row of patched ships and realised the day's true target had been certainty itself. Night fell on aluminum and promises. Eddie walked past a row of B-17Gs that looked like veterans emerging from a storm, patched noses, frayed antennae, boot prints in frost. At the depot hangar, a crew chief with oil under his nails briefed a maintenance line that would have read like poetry to anyone who knew the parts. Right R1820, cyclone swaps, supercharger checks, turret rewire, put a new plexiglass nose on Lucky Martha, fabricate a control cable fair lead from scrap. The work hummed in 3 tempos: inspect, repair, return to service, and the only luxury was light. Flood lamps turned night to a hard noon, and the smell was equal parts hot rivet and dope. 714 damaged bombers had returned from the March raid. The impossible part wasn't survival, it was knowing the system could absorb that many wounds and still fly tomorrow. A depot sergeant would have moved like a conductor, baton replaced by a clipboard. Armourers lifted belts of .50 caliber into ammo cans, counting links by habit. Metalsmiths dropped cherry rivets into holes that had yesterday been daylight. A boy from Kansas filed the edge of a bomb bay door until it sang sweet against the latch. This was logistics as intimacy, the human hand touching each place a shell had argued with a skin and convincing it to behave. They kept a stack of H2X radome panels on a cradle and a shelf of Norden sight brackets like church fixtures, because precision was not a slogan, it was a process. Eddie watched an engine change on a bird that had come back on 3. The old Cyclone sagged on the hoist, a tired heart. The new one gleamed like an oath. Someone chalked Run Up 0600 on the cowling. The schedule did not care about heroics, it measured virtue in turnarounds. In 1944 alone, American factories had produced roughly 96,000 military aircraft. B-17 totals would exceed 12,700 by war's end. Those numbers were not slogans to the men under the flood lamps. They were shelves, spares, tyres, tools, and the calm knowledge that if a part failed, a truck would bring another before the coffee cooled. Across the hangar, a radio played a thin stateside song, the sound of a country that could build and grieve at the same time. A rigger tied a red remove before flight streamer to a Pito cover and muttered a quiet joke about the English weather. Eddie touched the patched edge of his ship's side window, feeling the roughness where the skin had been hammered back to fairness. He thought of the ledger in Berlin and the chalkboard in the intel hut and understood that victory here was not thunder, but persistence. At dawn, a line chief whistled. Engines coughed and settled into that 9-cylinder heartbeat. The runway shimmered with cold. Men in parkas stepped back and raised thumbs. Machines built by a democracy rolled toward the sky, not because they were invulnerable, but because they were repairable. The day after the largest raid, the factory at the edge of the war opened on time. Marta arrived early and found the yard quieter than sleep. Snow had crusted in bomb craters, and the rails sang softly as they cooled, a sound like someone tuning a saw. She warmed her hands over a tea she had bought with a ration coupon and studied a switching diagram that no longer described anything on Earth. The morning freight for Kustrin would have been priority once. Now the line was impassable and the detour a fantasy. She wrote cancelled in a neat script and wished ink could be strong enough to move iron. Up in the zoo tower, Carl's crew worked through a list that felt like a confessional. Ammunition allotment reduced, barrels due for replacement, one predictor intermittent, communications to Friedrichshain unreliable. The men were competent, proud, and increasingly hungry. He had heard whispers about fuel stockpiles, the kind of rumours that grow best where truth is rationed. He did not need a report to tell him the jets were flying less. He could hear it in the spaces between sirens. A controller would have told him, candidly if off the record, that the Jumo engines on the Me-262 lived short lives measured in dozens of hours, and those hours evaporated when runways were crated and strafed. Walter stood by his machine and felt the cold climb through his boots. He had flown yesterday and claimed 2, and the victory tasted like a sweet he could not keep. The ground crews were magicians with pliers and hope. Bearings came late. Tyres arrived in ones, not pairs. He inspected his R4M racks and counted by touch, knowing that a mistimed ripple was a sin he could not afford. The jets would have launched in packets, not swarms, because swarms required fuel and uncrated concrete, and those were rarer than courage. A staff officer from the Reichsbahn came to the yard and spoke to Marta in polite phrases that signalled helplessness. He traced a line on the map with a gloved finger, promising a reroute that would carry wounded west by nightfall. She nodded and made his promise a column entry, already bracing to cross it out. The war had shifted from the loud to the stubborn. Every switch frozen in the wrong position was an infantry platoon short of ammunition somewhere far away. Every hour without coal at a tank plant was a battalion missing teeth next week. In the evening, Carl walked onto the tower roof and looked west into weather. He did not hate the men he fought. He hated the arithmetic that had made his skill and his tower and his courage insufficient. Somewhere beyond the clouds, trains stood silent and jets cooled in hardened pens, while Americans filled fuel trucks in the rain. He went back inside, laid his hand on the elevation wheel, and waited for the phone to ring. Tex skimmed the tree line with his radiator shutters cracked and his eyes hunting for the colour that betrayed a camouflaged wing. The squadron had briefed sweeps to arrive at recovery windows, that fragile margin between triumph and touchdown when even a jet had to obey gravity and speed limits. They had fuel to spare because someone in supply had done the math on drop tank allocations and tanker truck routes, and that, more than bravado, made aggression sound like prudence. He keyed his mic low and calm and brought 4 ships down the glide path in echelon. The first pass was over in a heartbeat, a pair of 262s on final, gear committed. The Mustangs stitched the runway edges and the dispersal, walking .50 caliber streams across the places where crews had stacked fuel drums behind a sandbagged smile. One jet lurched and skated, the other, caught before it could retract, slewed into grass and folded a nose wheel. There was no glee on the radios, only breathing. The flight climbed, curved and came again, not to win glory, but to deny the enemy tomorrow's sortie. They did not hover over the bomber stream unless called. They roamed ahead, behind, and along the egress routes, stalking piston fighters in the climb and strafing fields whose camouflage could fool only the unconcerned. It felt ruthless because it was strategic. When escorts stayed glued, the enemy had time to mass. When escorts hunted, the enemy bled in fragments. Loss ratios tilted not because one pilot was braver, but because the system was designed to stretch his reach and shorten his enemy's choices. In debrief that night, a weary controller offered a statistic that would have sounded like boasting if it hadn't been arithmetic. A single American factory had once produced a 4-engine bomber roughly every hour at peak, day after day, while the Luftwaffe counted serviceable fighters by the handful on some late-war mornings. The number wasn't a cudgel to beat men with, it was a map of what was possible. The Willow Run lines did not guarantee victory over Berlin's jets, but they guaranteed that even perfect German tactics would be swallowed by repetition. The impossible statistic felt like a verdict on doctrine as much as industry. If your enemy can replace aircraft faster than you can plan to destroy them, the only sane tactic is to prevent him from taking off at all. Tex wrote a letter home that he would never send, the kind where a man tries to say careful things plainly. Then he cleaned carbon from his gun ports with a rag, not because it was heroic, but because tomorrow's work required it. Out on the line, a crew chief checked a seam with his thumbnail and nodded to no one. The weather would decide the rest. In the intel hut, the wall held a mosaic of days. Strike photos from February hung beside the images from March, rails etched like veins, stations dark where roofs had caved. An officer stood with a pointer and did what good officers do. He told the truth plainly. On the 3rd of February, roughly 1,003 B-17 bombers were dispatched. 937 bombed Berlin, 23 were lost. On the 18th of March, 1,329 heavy bombers and 733 fighters launched. 1,221 bombers struck the capital. More than 3,000 tons fell. 24 bombers and 6 fighters did not come home. 714 returned with holes and stories. The room breathed those numbers the way men breathe cold air, sharp and necessary. Eddie stared at a photo of the Tempelhof lattice and felt again the short, steady squeeze of the toggle. He could still taste the oxygen, still hear the unfunny jokes meant to make time manageable. The officer shifted from pictures to cause. Rail paralysis was not spectacle, it was viscosity. Trains slowed, then stopped. Priority orders stacked on forms like drifted snow. Armoured plants idled, waiting for bearings that were now in a crater. The transportation plan was never a single hammer blow. It was thousands of taps on the same nerve. Across the city that had been the target, Marta pinned ration coupons and cancelled runs to a corkboard, as if pinning butterflies that would not sit still. She took calls from stations that needed coal, replied with schedules that had become wishes, and then drew neat lines through her own promises. She did not need a communique to know the effect. She could measure it in men sleeping on benches, in a switchman's hands shaking from cold and fatigue, in a whispered joke about eating turnips with turnips. Carl, off shift, walked past a market where the emptiness showed in the spaces between sacks. He thought of the tower's routines: load, lock, fire, extract, and of how disciplined work could still be outflanked by a world where your enemy made aircraft like other countries made shoes. He did not think in doctrines, but he understood sequence. Air superiority let bombers work, bombers cut rails starved fronts lost ground. By nightfall, Eddie folded a letter to a mother whose son had not come back from the March mission, a letter whose sentences would be perfect and insufficient. Marta locked her office and stared at rails that glinted with the false promise of readiness. In the hut, someone turned off the light, and the photos held their own pale glow in the dark. The war's shape was suddenly simple and unbearably large. The line made its way into coffee table captions and late-night arguments. 1,131 B-17 bombers bombed Berlin in a single day. Eddie heard it years later and felt two things at once: a tug of pride and the itch of a man who remembers the briefing slide. The truth, recorded in mission logs and debriefs, was stranger and grander. On the 3rd of February 1945, the 8th Air Force dispatched about 1,003 B-17 bombers and 937 bombed the city, with 23 lost. On the 18th of March 1945, the largest raid on Berlin assembled 1,329 heavy bombers with 733 fighters. 1,221 bombers dropped more than 3,000 tons, losing 24. The myth condensed these days into a single headline number. The math shows something larger than a single headline could carry. Memory prefers a clean hook. 1,131 feels like a spear you can grab. The record is a net. Multiple thousand-plane armadas within 6 weeks, jets slashing and vanishing, flak towers punching holes in the sky, 114 bombers returning damaged and mended in time to fly again. The story that honours the men is not that once there were impossibly many, but that often there were more than enough, and often enough was repeated. That is harder to print on a poster, easier to live inside if you wore the gear. Walter would have bristled at simplification because simplification robs competence of its dignity. He had seen jets make wreckage in seconds and then watched the sky refill with fortresses as if the earth itself were an assembly line. Carl would have nodded when someone said the number out loud and then pointed quietly to the boxes of empty shell cases in a corner. Marta, asked by a nephew after the war, would have said that the days she remembers smelled of coal dust and panic, and that the figure people repeat is less important than the trains that never came. The myth persists because we want ore cheap. The math endures because it asks us to respect systems as much as heroes. To say that 1,131 B-17s hit Berlin once is to be impressed. To grasp that the Americans sent more than 1,000 heavy bombers twice, that their factories built roughly 96,000 aircraft in 1944, that their depots could absorb 714 wounds in a day and still present a formation at dawn. This is to understand why some wars end sooner than courage alone would permit. Eddie kept his own clipping, folded soft with years, and on its margin he wrote the correction. He did it for the men who didn't come home, and for the ones who did, so that the record would do its job again, take something unbelievable and make it true. Years later, Eddie stood under a museum light that made the B-17's skin look like winter sun on water. A child ran a finger along a row of patches and asked a question no plaque could satisfy. Eddie tried anyway. He talked about oxygen masks and drift angles, about Norden glass and toggles, and then about the people who made those words matter. The machinists who cut cylinder heads at midnight, the women who wired turrets with hands steadier than fear, the crew chiefs who believed aluminum could be persuaded to behave. He did not romanticize it. He explained it the way a map explains a country you think you already know. He said that victory came from courage multiplied by industry. He said that in 1944 the United States produced roughly 96,000 military aircraft, and that by war's end American factories turned out more than 300,000. He said a single day, 18 March 1945, saw 1,329 heavy bombers and 733 fighters lift, 1,221 bombers strike Berlin, more than 3,000 tons fall, 714 aircraft return damaged and repairable. He said these numbers were not abstractions, but systems designed by a democracy that trusted citizens to read, vote, build, and fight. Tex, older, would have added doctrine to the litany. Air superiority first, he would say, then everything else becomes possible. Escorts hunt, bombers strike, rails fail, armies slow, wars end. Carl, if he ever visited the same museum, might have read the placard beside a flak shell and nodded at the craft, then stood at a window and watched children running where he once listened for engines, and felt relief swallow bitterness. Marta would have approved of the gift shop selling chocolate and postcards instead of ration chits. The legacy was not that America could smash cities, it was that a free people could organise factories, farms, schools and squadron rooms into a machine that repaired itself while advancing. It was that abundance, married to purpose, defeats cruelty that mistakes scarcity for virtue. It was that myths shrink what men did, while math, strange, cold, real, lets us honour them without lying. When the guard announced closing, Eddie touched the patched panel once more, like a relic, and looked up at the tail number as if it were a friend's name on a long roll. Outside, the evening smelled of rain, not cordite. He walked past a poster that still got the number wrong and did not mind. The truth was bigger. Somewhere, someone was counting rivets. Somewhere, someone was counting freedoms.